have David Zarb. We have David Zarb with us, who is the CEO of Playgroup Western Australia. And I have to say, if it happened in the Playgroup universe in the last 15 years, I think David will probably know about it. And I think he may well be the keeper of all knowledge within the Playgroup Australia network. So we're very pleased to have him here. Sam Page is the CEO of Early Childhood Australia. She has been in that role advocating for the learning and wellbeing of children for, I'm going to say, about 10 years now. And she is no doubt having a very busy budget week. Catherine Liddle, the CEO of SNAICC, National Voice for Our Children, is here. She's an Aranda Luritja woman, and she's been working flat out on advocacy for Indigenous children since she took up the CEO's role, must be getting on for 2 years ago now. Dr. Sue Packer, AM, who is a paediatrician, a former ACT Senior Australian of the Year, and a tenacious advocate for young children and their families, and tenacity is something we all need. Associate Professor Karen McLean from Australian Catholic University. Karen is one of the authors of our Playgroup Statement and someone who has been researching playgroups for years. Karen is based at the, let me get the name right, that's it, the Institute for Learning Sciences and Teacher Education at ACU. And Sally Matheson, the Education Benalla Program Manager at the Tomorrow Today Foundation. Sally, by background, is a speech pathologist, and she's now managing a program that provides hands-on support for early learning for children and families in playgroup settings. All right, I am going to start with my first set of questions. We've divided the questions loosely into 3 categories. So we've got policy and practice and research. And I'm going to say, let's start with policy. So David, I'm going to direct my first question to you. It's a deceptively simple question. Why did we need a playgroup statement?
Thanks, Amanda. I'm on Wajak Noongar country here in Perth, not far from the banks of the Derbarl Yerrigan, which is for over 170 years been boringly renamed as the Swan River. I think we needed the playgroup statement because we've really been stuck in a no man's land, a twilight zone with what we're doing with playgroups in this country. Despite all of the evidence we now have around the critical importance of positive relationships on children's development, on parents' development, of the dangers of socialisation throughout the life course, the way it affects, everything from your DNA to your ultimate life chances, connected with all sorts of things from Alzheimer's to heart disease. The thing we know, we have really left the playgroup sector to grow like an unkempt garden. We do not have, apart from a few small local examples, one of which I'm sure Sally will, other people will talk about, we've really not bothered to think about how we manage the interaction of our wonderful tradition of parent-led playgroups with professionally facilitated playgroups. We've not looked at every community to see what balance of what playgroups they need. We've not aspired to something like a universal proportional system, with the result that we have playgroups competing for venues, we have playgroups competing for families, and we have spent more and more money on playgroups with the end result of actually having less people involved in them. And I think we can do better. It is complicated because we have so many stakeholders. We have local, state, federal governments. We have local agencies, local communities, and local families. But rather than shy away from the complication, I think we should be embracing it with all we say about place-based management and local design and co-design. Playgroups somehow being left off the edge of that conversation, and we need to get it back in the middle of it. Because it's social isolation is as important to children's outcomes and families' outcomes as poverty and homelessness. And we need to start thinking about social relationships that way and work at it.
Thanks, David. That's a great way of framing this entire discussion, I think. If we were to look to the future and imagine a bright future for playgroups, can you tell me what would that look like, a bright future for playgroups? And importantly, what do governments need to do to help us get there?
I think we need to start thinking about what we're doing to support people when they're pregnant as a starting point. We have talked a lot about the first 1,000 days in this country, but I'm not actually saying that we've done much about it in practice. We're experimenting with some of that over here with some Lottery West money, but making sure that families are connected at the time when they need support the most. I think the changes in the signalling about the changes to parental leave are fantastic, and hopefully they are just the start. We know from international work that, an ideal scenario will have families very connected and supported and comfortable in their local community at the time when they are working, using the early care and education formal system and in the workforce. And I say families, I'm not talking about men and women, because I think that debate, we need men to work a bit less. That would solve some of the problem. But that is an ideal mix. People need the formal education and they need the social support. They're not in competition with each other. And it can be done. When you think about what playgroups achieved, in the last 50 years, millions and millions of attendances for systems that had no funding for the first 10 years of their life, pretty much. Playgroups that have lasted for 40, 50 years in their local communities and sustained themselves. There's clearly a lot of capacity there. We just need to work better at harnessing it.
Thanks very much. I am going to move on now to Sam Page to ask you, following on from David's comments, where do you think that playgroups are fitting into the broader early childhood landscape in Australia right now?
I think David's analogy of a garden is a really good one, because I remember having a conversation with Jenny McLean back when she was the Minister for what was, I think, FAXIA or some ridiculously long acronym back then, saying, well, tell me what's more important, home visiting, child maternal health, playgroups or preschool. And I'm like, you can't choose one of those. Like, we need to have a rich and diverse range of supports available to families with young children, and we need to end the Hunger Games between my model's better than your model, or this one gets funding and that one doesn't. I think we really need to work together. Playgroups, I think in the statement it's really lovely, the diagram that situates playgroups between the early childhood education and care sector and the child and family support sector. I think that's very apt. It's almost a bridge between the two. It can assist children and families to be comfortable in coming to services and being in service venues, but it's not, it's a much softer entry point than a formal early childhood program. And I think if we can work together, as David says, to support parents with families with young children, and I do think that's an important reorientation. It's not about how do we have more money for playgroups? It's about how do we better support families with young children, and playgroups are a really important part of that. They need to be part of a suite of programs, and those programs need to be better connected. I think we do have lots of communities where we've got programs running in parallel or in isolation to each other, and we're not making the connections between services that we could be. But having said that, it's also, we very much support the statement as a recognition of the important role that playgroups can play in the lives of families with young children, and particularly families becoming families for the first time, having that first child. It's a very stressful time, and we know, I've been lucky enough to be involved in PANDA, the Perinatal Anxiety and Depression Association, and we know that supporting families from pregnancy through the birth of the child and then immediately afterwards is just can make a really critical difference to their capacity long term and the mental health and wellbeing of both parents and children. So we really need to be united, I think, in saying to government, it's not one or the other, it's all of these. Yes, we can make it as efficient and as economically responsible as possible. We're not into over servicing or duplicating, but we do need a suite of programs to provide to families, particularly as they make that transition to parenthood for the first time.
So just thinking about, what you've said about the fact that it is a whole, it's a whole landscape. There are a whole suite of things that we need to do for families. What do you think governments could do right now to help ensure that playgroups as part of that landscape are delivering really good results for children?
Well, I was reflecting, I think it was 20 years ago, maybe more. I'm really showing my age, that I was lucky enough to be involved in a review of the playgroup movement back then. But also at the same time, we were doing a review of children's services, childcare beyond 2000. I think that's how much it dates me. And I think one of the best processes I've ever been involved in was to go to communities and do a thorough community consultation. So talk to everybody, talk to local government, talk to service providers, talk to families, talk to health practitioners, talk to everybody about what the strengths of that community are and what the needs are and why they're not being met. And at a local level, you can often find solutions that aren't apparent at the state or federal government level. And I think this is what we really need to encourage governments to do, because it's not one size fits all. We're seeing that with the childcare subsidy. It doesn't work. It doesn't work in remote communities. It doesn't work for Aboriginal communities and families. So let's drop this idea that we can have one solution for everywhere and instead accept that we need different approaches in different places. And that solutions need to be informed by the local community. And there are often quite innovative solutions to long-standing problems when you get people in a room together. I remember having a conversation in a mining town, for example, where there was a lack of early childhood education for very young children, and nobody really realised that was the case. And the problem was that there was a lack of a suitable building, but the mining company had plenty of buildings available. As soon as they knew that, we could leverage that and find a provider and connect them with federal government funding and solve that problem. But those kind of solutions need to be solved at the local level, I think, within a framework of national agreement on what are the values that we're trying to achieve, what is the vision that we have for young children, and what are the regulatory, safeguards we want to put in place around programs. And I do think regulatory safeguards are important, particularly in services where children's families are not present, but also, just to make sure that we have a good use of any funding invested.
Thanks, Sam. I'm going to bring Catherine Liddle in now. Catherine, I'm interested in your view on what role playgroups play, or what role they could play in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities across Australia.
Oh, look, I think, my brain is going in two different directions at this moment in time. In actual fact, it was a mildly, I'm one of those people that thinks about multiple things simultaneously. And while David was talking about the untended garden, I was thinking, God, that's a really good description for my brain. Anyhow, those two things. I'm going to acknowledge that I'm sitting on Wurundjeri country, but I'm also going to acknowledge that the opening lines of the statement, where it refers to the fact that children, have played for thousands of years. And I think that's awesome, because a lot of what's happening in Australia at this moment, at this extraordinary moment in time, is about changing language and understanding how language frames expectation and engagement. And a lot of the work that SNAICC does is about saying, well, if we can't see ourselves in policy, if we can't see ourselves in programs, if we can't see ourselves in language from the moment we open a page or read a statement, then we've got a problem. We're so used to being addendums or other. And in actual fact, we're First Nations. We should be inherent in everything that we talk about in Australia. So number one, huge kudos for using that language. I think the other huge kudos in that is the second point, and that is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have always understood the importance of play. And the reason that's really high on my brain at this moment in time is I've just come back from Palm Island. How lucky am I? I got a trip to Palm Island to talk to Mob there about their early years conference. And as part of that, they said, listen, can you facilitate a forum for us? Yeah, no worries. And the topic was keeping children safe. And we started by having a conversation about, okay, what does it look like if everything is going well right now at this point in time? What is good? And the first thing they identified was opportunities for parents to play with babies. and young children. In a conversation about how do you keep children safe, there was that acknowledgement. And again, it goes to the heart of what we're talking about, and that is that we've always understood that playing with children, creating those opportunities for children to be part of the family, to engage, has always been fundamental to our understanding of effective development. So there's and at this point in time, you know, we have all these new, I guess, research, all this research coming out internationally and both nationally that shows that our understanding of the ways that we play with our families when they're uninterrupted by things like colonisation are our best practice. You know, the evidence is coming in. And again, that was something that came through really strongly as part of that conversation is, you know, why is it it's not until other people come up with the evidence that proves that we actually understood how to do these things that it becomes valid. But again, it is all circling. It is all circling. And while I know that part of that conversation that I had while I was on Palm Island was about moving away from the pain of colonisation and the impacts of marginalisation or feeling like or experiencing vulnerability, was that also acknowledgement that there appears to be a huge shift to understanding, and I think a lot of what Sam was speaking to, it picks up on it, and that is, if we're going to do this properly, then we need to be responding to the needs of particular communities. What does play look like in your environment? If there's a lot of rain, where do you play? If it's really hot and dry, where do you play? Do you play with inside a building, or do you sit underneath a tree? So what we're starting to see as those things come to fruition, a greater acceptance and acknowledgement that playgroups could be anything, and they need to be responsive. But we're also seeing, which is, and again reflects, I guess, the language of the statement, a greater commitment for Aboriginal community control as well. And that is moving beyond the lip service of, yes, we want to work with you in partnership, but rather this incredible, genuine commitment to resourcing Aboriginal solutions. And that includes Aboriginal designed playgroups. We know that, you know, not so long ago, before funding models changed, our Aboriginal controlled early years and family services weren't restricted in the way that they are now, and that is by individualised grants and short-term funding that disappears. And they were able to offer playgroups right across Australia, and it was a very, very different landscape when they were able to do it. So again, when we look at what the opportunities are, it's a high five on this particular playgroup statement, because it really does marry with what we've been advocating for a long time, and that is, you know, how do we reflect our ambitions to be with our baby? How do we help them understand play and storytelling and sitting with each other and yarning and looking after each other? And we know that our best ways of practice, and again, this came through really strongly over the last couple of days, was that our learn experiences are shaped differently when we're able to frame the conversation, frame what play looks like, and to share stories that are so much more comprehensive than anything you could read in a book, simply because everything we do is nuanced to the surroundings and the communities that we live and work within.
There's that image of, you know, the idea of play being a precursor for safety for children is a really powerful one. Thank you for sharing that with us. And I might just ask a quick follow-up question, and that's about this idea of, you know, more First Nations led playgroups, and how do we make that happen? I know we don't have a lot of the detail yet, but there was an announcement in last night's budget. So, you know, what do you think, you know, the future holds? Is there a little window of opportunity there to really ramp up the potential for communities to create and lead their own playgroups?
Oh, look, I think the window is there, absolutely. And I guess as a peak body, one of our jobs will be to make sure that that window turns into a massive bifolding door that can concertina out, because we absolutely know, and I'm sure the conversation has reflected that already, that the biggest fight we have in order to be able to offer these services is is the current funding model. And Sam spoke to that. You know, how do you have, you can't promise universality if it's not universally accessible. You know, this is just that's a no-brainer, that one. And we want to be looking at opportunities to be more, I guess, culturally accessible. And I was just thinking about what you were saying again. This is that, you know, untamed garden of my brain. When we are talking about different ways of telling stories, you know, our old ways, you know, in my country in particular, would be to use the leaves and create these personalities of these leaves. And as you created that personality, you'd be able to talk about how behaviours impacted on different people and what the consequences of behaviours might be. And those things could include being loved, not feeling loved, being bullied, being mean to somebody, all those types of things, and how the leaves would respond by crying or bending or becoming broken as a result of that. And I was just thinking about, you know, the opportunity to bring those things in again in a way that was accessible to everyone, and what that might mean, particularly in an age where we are becoming more and more dependent on things like social media. But that's one way of looking at it. And again, if I was to expand on that approach, when stories like that are told, they also bring in other parts of the community, and children are learning about impacts on behaviours, not only for themselves, but for families, but your broader community as well, which is in line with the way we do develop and roll out our playgroups. And that is a holistic response, really. That is something that focuses on all family members and is more likely to include things like health and nutrition, child and social protection, culture and learning, and of course those fundamental elements of nurture and care. So we know that when we're able to deliver playgroups that way, we're able to respond to a whole heap of different social determinants that we're able to tackle before they become a massive disparity in the early outcomes for our children, but as David said, the long-term outputs and outcomes for our kids as well. So we are absolutely excited about that window. We're really hoping that there is more change coming, and that we are going to be able to move into an environment where we genuinely have an integrated umbrella and whole range of supports available through families, for families, which playgroups will be a fundamental part of, and that they do become universal, and that they do include things like targeted for our most vulnerable families.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Sue, I'm going to bring you in here, and I'm going to circle back to another deceptively simple question. And I would like to hear from you. Why do playgroups matter?
Thank you very much. David, you started things off well with your garden theme. I think it is a chaotic garden. The whole scene is a chaotic garden. But I think my caution here is we have to weed that garden carefully. I think playgroups, to me, are the only, it all comes back to how does this country see children, particularly small children. And a lot of people say, well, of course we love children, they're terribly important, we care enormously. But in terms of actually what we do see provide, children are the flexible bit that get left out every time, as was shown so very clearly in our response to COVID. They're the ones that have to be malleable to enable the proper adult part of life to keep going as smoothly as possible. And I think that's where playgroup comes in as filling a critically important area. It is the one area involving children and their important people simultaneously. I think it's a cynical approach, but I feel the interest in early childhood education has a lot more to get mothers back to work than to do with what might be best for children. Although obviously it can be helpful. I think we also have to think about the fact, for all of our dream of the great Australian lifestyle and so on, we know that the 21st century lifestyle is very, very different. Families are far more isolated as nuclear little families, which might just be a parent and a child, or a struggling parent with a couple of children. We certainly don't have the extension with grandparents and aunts and uncles. You don't have the local shops. You don't have neighbours that you know and neighbours of different generations to share your experiences. At the same time, you're overloaded with a massive information on what you need to do to be a good parent and all the endless and terrible damage if you're not a good parent. So I think Playgroup offers the opportunity to put the child and child's important people central to a part of the day and help them connect with other people, because everything we do is relational. And that's another thing we tend to forget. We do a lot of it talking about learning, but children learn in relationships. They learn to delight other people. The other thought I had in the middle of all this, I have a Catherine type chaotic brain that goes in many circles in different directions. But for many people, for many adults, play is only legitimate as a tool or a pathway for the child to acquire knowledge which is defined by adults as being relevant. And to me, play is the critical and most important means of communicating with a child, not the child learning. The child is looking at this huge world, this changing world through their own amazed eyes that haven't had our lifetime of experience. They're trying to make sense of what they're seeing and hearing and doing. Play is the ultimate and fantastic tool for them to try and let us know what's bewildering them, what's delighting them. We have to be with them to get these messages. And they are often very subtle messages and you have to be tuned in. And I think playgroups, when they're done in a supported and caring, safe place way, can be a superlative way for parents to get more confidence in their skills to do this. There's still this apology about playing. I'm wasting time playing. I don't know what we need to do to change this.
Thank you, Sue. And I want to ask one follow-up question, and that is if we're not providing all families with the opportunities to be in their community in a playgroup setting, what are those families missing out on?
I think they're missing out on a lot of the delight of being a parent. Being a parent is not an introverted experience, delighting in your child, important and all as that is. You're preparing this child for the rest of their lives. The child is modelling what happens in the rest of their lives by how you respond. Your child needs to be with you in social situations to learn how to become a proper social animal. And a playgroup can be a superlative place to do this, where there's no other agenda, where the agenda is being a child or being a parent and helping each other through this very tricky pathway.
Thanks, Sue. Sally, I'm going to turn to you now for a bit of, I suppose, reporting from the front lines of playgroups. We talk about playgroups as sites for community connections and community building. What does that look like in practice where you are?
Thanks, Amanda. So just to give a bit of context, Tomorrow Today is based in Benalla, northeast Victoria, so around about 200 kilometres north of Melbourne. And we rank in the top 5% of disadvantaged postcodes across Victoria. We have a population of 14,000 people. And it was determined that we needed to do something to improve the outcomes for our young people in this town, and that education was the answer to turn around the disadvantaged status of our community. So back in 2012, we introduced the PEEP program in Benalla. So PEEP stands for Parents Early Education Partnership. So you'll see there that the focus is on parents. The program recognises and supports parents as their child's first and most important ongoing educator. And I'd like to really highlight the word ongoing there as well, because we know that education doesn't just occur at school. Education occurs within the home, within the community, and within school. So with our PEEP program, we have fantastic community buy-in. We have 60 community partners that contribute to the program in any given year, and they contribute through referring families into the program. They also contribute by providing guest speakers for our program. And the guest speakers are fantastic because it provides a friendly face, a familiar face, that if you need to access that service in the future, you've got that connection, that warm handover straight away. We also have community donors who donate funds to ensure the sustainability of the program in our community, and community volunteers who come in and give of their time to read with the children, to assist with children's play. But the beauty of this program is it's not just parents learning through a facilitated playgroup. The parents learn from each other, and they really create that support community within themselves. They come in and troubleshoot situations, saying things like, "You'll never believe what little Johnny did in the supermarket this morning." And every parent just breathes a sigh of relief. You know, I'm not the only one who's experienced that. And they learn from each other. So even though we are a facilitated playgroup, where we do have trained staff that do facilitate those conversations, the conversations are very much parent-led and based on the need of our parents in our community at that time.
Thanks, Sally. That's a really great snapshot of what you're doing. But I'm also really interested, partly because you're in Victoria, I'd like to know, what did we learn about playgroups during the COVID lockdown era? Like, what did we learn that we should take with us as we move, hopefully, away from that period?
Oh, we learned that just that person-to-person connection is absolutely critical for parents to be able to debrief, to have that support network, for children to be able to mix with each other during that time. We attempted to run PEEP online, so we ran it through Zoom. We also provided pre-recorded information and put it onto our website and our Facebook pages. And initially there was great buy-in to that because people were excited to see their favourite PEEP facilitator online, and they could access that at any time when it was pre-recorded. We also had the very fortunate opportunity to have a pre-recorded session with Jayla Geyer and also with Dr. Justin Coulson, who were incredibly giving of their time for our community. But we found that screen fatigue, not just with our school students, but with our parents, kicked in pretty quickly. So we had to move quickly. We trained our staff in effective listening skills because our staff were very used to engaging with families in a group situation, but not so much one-on-one. So we trained them in effective listening. They contacted every single family in our program. So we have 190 families registered to attend the program. They made phone contact regularly with all of those families. And then also we use the rule of being able to exercise with one person outside of your family home to our advantage. And we engaged families in walk and talks, where we would meet families down at the park, bring along a hot chocolate, a cappuccino for them, and go for a walk for an hour with them, just to have that adult listening ear for them and just a chance for them to offload and have some adult company during that time.
Thanks so much, Sally. Yeah, interesting to reflect on that, and hopefully not something we're going back to, but the importance of that face-to-face contact is something that I think we're all almost painfully aware of now. Karen, I would love to turn to you now as one of the authors of our Playgroup Statement. And I'd like to ask you, from an early childhood researcher's perspective, how important are playgroups? What's your perspective on that?
Thanks, Amanda. Just before I talk about that, I would actually just like to acknowledge that I'm sitting on Motherland country. And also, I'd also like to acknowledge my colleague, co-author and co-chair for the National Advisory Group, Professor Susan Edwards, who is online today, and also some of our other team members actually who had also involved and had valued contributions to the development of the statement. So yeah, in response to your question about an early childhood researcher's perspective, that's an interesting one. I've been, as you indicated earlier, I've been working in this space now for a long time. So myself personally, I'm very passionate about playgroup research. And in our research, we really focus on young children's cultural context and relationships for play, learning and development. So playgroups are really important to us as early childhood researchers. And I find actually can't really answer that question without thinking about the first figure in the statement, figure 1. So, and I've been delighted to hear the engagement from panel members and also in the chat there, that people have already been engaging in the conversation around the playgroup statement. So I'm, you know, as someone who did have a big role in writing that, I'm really excited about that, the contributions and the engagement that's already happening in that space. So from an early childhood researcher's perspective, that figure 1 is really important to me. And it's important because it really situates playgroups as central in communities, but also within the context of family support services and the early childhood education sector. And that really makes them very unique. I think each of the other panel members have really pinpointed different aspects of how that makes playgroups unique. But particularly with the family support services, in terms of providing connections and resources to and connections to networks that are enabling for adult caregivers in their role, and also in the early childhood sector for working with professionals in collaboration with children, parents and early childhood teachers, for example. So when we really think of, when I look at that figure, as an early childhood researcher, I really see this exciting multidisciplinary context for enabling children and their adults simultaneous, or if you like, dual learning together. And I think that's really unique about playgroups. And we have touched on it, why, you know, they have such an important value in the Australian community. What the statement tries to do is, what the statement does is bring out what are those benefits for beneficial outcomes for children, particularly around learning and development, that we know extend beyond the early years, and for their adult caregivers and for families that extend actually back into the home learning environment, into opportunities for employment, and, you know, into the long-term sort of fabric of the Australian society. So for me, as an early childhood researcher, I think that is a really unique aspect about playgroups, and it's why, you know, they're really important for us to continue to learn more about. They make a unique contribution as we're reading through the statement. We're showing that value in a way that we haven't, you know, had the opportunity really to engage with or see before. And thank you, Amanda, for putting that figure up so that you can see what I'm actually talking to in terms of where playgroups are situated within the broader community. And for those of us in research, again, that sits really nicely with the bioecological theoretical lens, where playgroups are really incredibly important as a unique part of the Australian society, because they're nested within that microsystem, situated within, as the figure shows, family support services and early childhood education and care, for promoting those wonderful relationships. And I know Sue mentioned before about the importance, the relational aspect, and how important that is in early childhood. And certainly some of the research that we've been doing has really looked at those strong bonding and bridging relationships, and how playgroup participation really contributes to those relationships that are so important for children and their families.
Thanks, Karen. Now, my next question for you is slightly tongue-in-cheek, but only slightly. So if there was one part of the research about playgroups that you could force policymakers to learn by heart, what would it be?
Well, you know, actually listening, Amanda, to what the other panelists have been saying, it really reinforces this point for me, because actually the one thing that I would like policymakers to learn by heart, I think it would be that all playgroups make an incredible economic and social contribution to the Australian society, but they need to be recognised in their own right for those value contributions they make. And again, so if you'd like to put the screen up again, figure 2, I'm going to talk about figure 2 this time in the statement, because this figure to me is really important. And it's important because it illustrates the 3 components which operate in their various combinations to differentiate by type playgroups for children and their families. And when we think about those 3 components, so the first one really is just the extent to which playgroups are either parent-led, in other words, run by families, or service-led, being run by government, not-for-profit or school-based and other organisations. The second component there in the diagram that in the figure that we have up on the screen really represents the different cohorts who attend. And this can be inclusive of all people, or they may be more specifically defined, for example, by language or capabilities or cultural interests. And I think, again, coming through the panel discussion today, we've seen, you know, how important moving forward in terms of that that universal recognition of playgroups, how important it is to really understand the way that playgroups work in this way. The third component refers to the focus of activity. So that, for example, the focus of activity may be on nature play, outdoor play, or I know that intergenerational playgroups, for example, are something of increasing interest recently, and the focus in them is to facilitate strong connections with senior citizens through play. So all those various combinations that come together from those three components in that figure actually add complexity to playgroups. But I think it's also through this complexity that ensures that playgroups are responsive. And I know Catherine was talking earlier about the need for that responsiveness. And I think that that figure really illustrates that. It enables them to respond to the unique circumstances of children and families. So we know, we've talked about that playgroups have existed in Australia since the 1970s and in fact overseas since the 1950s. But I'd really like policymakers to recognise the value that each type of those playgroups bring to that social and economic prosperity of Australia through appropriate representation really of the different types in policy formation, funding and implementation.
Okay. And Karen, I have one final question for you before we ask the audience if they have some. And that is, what do we need to do right now, to build the evidence base for playgroups?
Okay, well, this one, Amanda, I'm really passionate about. I can't talk about this without talking about the Playgroup Statement again, but that is because the Playgroup Statement really articulates what we know about playgroup research to date and about the important contributions that makes to our understanding of the value of playgroups in the Australian society. But we also know, and it also articulates quite clearly, that more research still needs to be done to build that evidence base. Why? Because we really need to ensure that all children and their families have optimal opportunities to benefit from participation in playgroups, through that dual simultaneous opportunities to learn together that, has already come through today, is just so important. And what the statement does, and I think this conversation started with David as the first speaker today, it really identifies the complexities associated with playgroup provision in practice, policy and research. And it identifies what needs to be addressed to ensure universal recognition, not only for the contribution to Australian society, but actually internationally. And so from a research perspective, we know that these complexities are associated with multiple discipline areas. So there's a lot going on in playgroup research, but it's all in these little pockets of discipline areas. And to date, they all use various methodologies. And to date, we haven't yet come around to integrating them. So we don't actually, when it comes to scale and translation, so translating research, playgroup research into something that we can utilise in practice in playgroups, one of the issues that we come up against again and again is the scale and translation, is that data linkage and also the coherency and the clarity around the types of playgroups, that figure that we were talking about before in terms of that figure 2, all the different types. So, actually being able to do something with the research that becomes translatable in practice. So in terms of the call to action, we know in terms of building that robust evidence base, we know what's needed in terms of multidisciplinary researchers' approaches, which is what the call to action is asking for. So in other words, working with our colleagues in other disciplines, such as in education, so in family studies, psychology and health, bringing those other disciplines together so that we can achieve the scale and data linkage and generation, but also in providing consistency and coherency when we're reporting about playgroup research in terms of that, if I go back to that figure 2, what type that are. And that's really important, because if we're getting right down into the nitty gritty about that, we can ensure that families, as David mentioned earlier, as families and children have access to the playgroups they need in their communities that meet their unique circumstances.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's great. It's great to get the view from behind the curtain in the world of research and academia, to get a sense of what's been happening and what we could do if we could really harness all of the resources and efforts that we need to build that evidence base and make it stronger and translate the findings, importantly, so that we can do better on the ground with children and families. I am now going to open the floor to questions. I would love to see them in the chat box. That's going to be a little bit easier for us to manage. I've got one there already, and the question from Felicity, hello Felicity, is it's a big question, what do we need to do so that more families participate in playgroup? David, would you like to have a first crack at this one?
Sure. I think we've first got to agree that we'd like that to be a good thing to happen.
Controversial, David.
I don't think that as a community and as a system and as a policy system and in a research system, we've actually made that commitment. We also need to have a think about playgroup is a real test of a lot of our principles when it comes to working with children and families. You know, we talk about families as first teachers, we talk about strengths-based practice, we talk about sustainability, we talk about the ecological model of the child, all those things. And yet, if you look at how playgroup works, we don't actually enact many of them. We need more buildings. I know that's one. I mean, a place to meet is a pretty fundamental issue. And in outer suburban areas, you know, development corridors, venues are a real issue. I think schools can help with that. We've done a bit of that work in WA, but then the schools need to be constructed so they have community space available. And not all of our schools are like that. I think we also need to come to terms with how do we think about something that is done by parents and caregivers and community members without us very successfully, as well as something that is done by a professional workforce working for agencies. Because I really think we're struggling with those crossovers. And you can see the outcome of those things there. A local government who charges their playgroups $40 a week to rent a space will then go and happily spend $30,000 to put in one supported playgroup because they think they need that's addressing social isolation. They could make playgroups free for 20 groups with the same money, but often that they don't make that decision. So I think the other thing we've got that is missing is a, and I hope that this statement and the announcement by the government last night and last week, we need some signalling from everybody that we actually agree that playgroups are useful and important.
Yeah.
At a policy level, and not just a social media level, because you know, there's all sorts of strange things that people identify as important on social media, and we can't control that. But at a policy level, at all levels of government, and this varies all over the place, so we've all got to work out in our own jurisdiction and our own local town, we need that commitment to be evident.
Thanks, David. Yeah, lots of layers of work to be done, probably all needing to be addressed simultaneously, I'd suggest. Sam, I'm just going to throw to you. You popped something in the chat in response to what David said about space, physical locations for playgroups. Do you want to expand on that?
Oh, well, we did have a conversation a few years ago about whether we should develop a template or a guide or something. I know some services do that. I know there's been some work, particularly with Good Start, for example, about hosting playgroups in early childhood service settings. And I think for a lot of services, they're just not sure how that would work or what their liabilities might be or what the, you know, how they would go about doing that. Should they charge? Should it be free? What would be the reciprocal, you know, benefit? I think that's potentially a piece of practical work that we could do quite easily and demonstrate how it has been done and what works about it and what's good for the children and the services and the family. So I think that would be something, but I'm not trying to, I know that's not the only solution to the need for premises and venues, but it's just potentially one angle on it. And I do think that issue of governments have increasingly wanted to control and direct how their investment is used. And so that works against us having flexible spaces in the community that can be used in different ways by different people without, you know, without having to give your shoe size and which type of house you live in and every bit of, you know, personal information in order to get access to it. I think we do need to have a conversation with government about, you know, one of the best things you can do for social connectedness is provide flexible spaces and flexible programs that are much, easier for people to access. One of the things we used to do in Canberra, I don't know if it's still running, is paint and play in the park, and families would just come and join in a paint activity, and it was a very easy thing to do. You didn't have to book in advance, you didn't have to come every week, you could just drop in. I think we need more of those very flexible programs as an adjunct to the other types of services that we have available.
Thanks, Sam. There's a question from Sue Tape about children with disability in their families and how the statement might help us to improve inclusion. I'm going to ask Sally whether you've got a view on, how do we shift to more accessible and inclusive playgroups that don't have to rely on, diagnosis-based cohorts, accessibility and inclusivity for all at all playgroups, I guess, is what Sue is getting at.
Absolutely. So we run 16 PEEP groups a week. We have 190 families registered, and we have families coming along with children who don't have a diagnosis, but it's clear that they most likely will have a diagnosis at some stage, and also families with children that do have a diagnosis. Everybody's made to feel welcome within the group. We have some children that just cannot settle at all. They will just wander, and our staff are really fantastic at just nurturing those families along and say, keep coming back. If you keep coming back, your child will see what happens as part of this group, and they'll start to settle. And recently we had a boy who started coming in, 3-year-old, who is a real flapper, totally non-verbal, rocking. He couldn't even get into the PEEP room, but he would watch from outside. And gradually he starts coming into the PEEP room. So he now comes into the PEEP room and takes part in the song and circle time of PEEP. He doesn't sit the whole time, but he's in the PEEP room and he's seeing what's happening, and he's seeing what's being modelled from the other children. Plus mum is seeing how the other parents work with their children. And that's what's so powerful about it. So certainly open to all, inclusive of all. We don't have a separate group just for disability. Everybody is part of PEEP.
Thanks, Sally.
Can I add, Amanda, we run the NDIS Early Childhood Pathway in Darwin, and there's a lovely playgroup model happening up there for families who are going through the NDIS process and haven't got a diagnosis and may never get a diagnosis as such, but are experiencing so the need to support and connect with other parents that are in similar situations. And I think the NDIS Early Childhood Pathways could do more of that. I think it's quite unusual to have that model, but it's something that Playgroups Australia could potentially facilitate with the NDIS.
Right, thank you. Thank you both of you, Sally and Sam. I've got a question here which I think is really pertinent. It's from the president of Newtown Playgroups, and it's about the work of those volunteers who run the community organisations. And the question is, how can we better support good governance of parent-led playgroups? We're finding it challenging to form a committee to run the playgroup functions. I might ask you, Catherine, whether you've got a view on the volunteer load. When we talk about community-led initiatives and community-led groups, what we're saying is that there is a load that rests with volunteers. Yeah. How tricky is that to manage when you're saying we want community to lead, but we know we don't want to overburden you?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? And again, one that comes up in rooms relating to Aboriginal engagement all the time, because a lot of it is about come into the rooms and while you're here, give us your expertise, but we're not going to pay you for it. Whilst being 100% cognizant that there's no jobs out there for you in the first place, and even if they were, they wouldn't be developed in a way that would enable you to access them. So I think what can playgroups do about it themselves? Look, I think there is always going to be someone who steps into the space, and if that is a safe space, that is a fantastic thing. I think understanding what that looks like when you create pathways for empowerment is fantastic, and pathways for self-determination. But perhaps there does need to be something more, and whether or not that is a backbone support, particularly when we're talking about things like governance, that means, well, here's your framework and here's how it applies to your context, and here's how you translate that for your environment. So we obviously have to do a lot of that work, not necessarily with our playgroups, but with our early learning centres, where they say these things are too complex and we're too busy doing this work over here. Can you help us with it? So there probably is some work that can be done in order to help communities do that. But potentially, I mean, you know, do we need to look at things where there is some sort of, I don't know, there's a word that starts with NEM and I can't find it, but you do pay people on some level for their expertise, particularly if they are coming from nuanced backgrounds where those skills don't exist anywhere else in the world, and that does include things like migrant families, First Nations families, those sorts of things, because without those skills in the room, you're not going to be able to function. And I'm going to shift slightly because that's how I roll. But I was also thinking about the accessibility and the inclusion piece, because for First Nations people, we don't identify disability. You just are. And our children are always treated equally in those environments. So they're always responding to children who might have additional learning needs. And being First Nations, it certainly the evidence shows that certainly those families and those communities where there are high levels of vulnerability, you know, we have groups of children where up to 90% of them might have additional learning needs. So these are just things that we do. We just accept that that's what it is. But we also understand, and I think Sam spoke to it a bit, that sometimes these learning play groups, you need to go to where the people are, because our mob, half the problem is getting in through the door in the first place, and understanding that it's a bit scary to walk through those doors. So how else can you provide these services to those families that need it the most?
Thanks very much, Catherine. And we have hit time, everyone. So I will simply thank, from the bottom of my heart, our fantastic panel today. I think we've kicked off a really interesting conversation. It's the first, it won't be the last. Thank you very much to David Zarb, Sam Page, Catherine Liddle, Sue Packer, Karen McLean and Sally Matheson for their time and expertise. Thank you all for attending, and you're very welcome to get in touch with us at Playgroup Australia if you need more information about the Playgroup Statement or you want to keep the conversation going. So thanks very much everyone for your time today. Goodbye.